Hello, everyone. So this is going to be the last lecture of the term. I'm just going to combine today and Thursday's lecture. I wasn't going to really cover anything new on Thursday anyway, besides just give some details about the final. So what I'm going to talk about today, just three different things that I want to introduce for lecture content. We'll talk about spatiotemporal GIS. So how do you deal with the temporal aspect of data? Just talk about some strategies for displaying that. Then I'm going to talk about ethics, which is one of the most important things in GIS. If you start to do GIS work, you really have to think about how the work you do impacts other people and the impacts that the decisions and choices made within a GIS can have on the real world. Then I'm going to talk about participatory GIS. So what are strategies or ways for engaging the public in GIS work? And then I'm going to talk just a little bit about the final exam, give you a little bit more info about what you can expect from that, and also cover up any last final details regarding like how you can kind of think about or calculate your mark thus far and things like that. The first thing I want to talk about today is the concept of spatiotemporal GIS, so adding a temporal or time-based component to our analysis. So most of the things that you want to know about in the world have three main components: what they are, where they are, and when they occur. So if you have the where and the what, you can make a static map and you can show something. You can show the what and how it is in space or where it is. If you have what and when, you can make a chart to show the evolution of something through time. But if you have all three, how do we approach that? So if we have all three cases, what, where, and when, what do we need to incorporate to share this with others? How's the best way to present this type of information? So nearly everything we're interested in studying in the natural and social sciences has some sort of temporal element to it. So most GIS have both a spatial and a temporal component. For instance, census data is collected every 5 years. So if you want to look at census data, you know, look at one snapshot in time, just 1 year, like the 2016 data, or you can look at how it's evolved over time. How have demographics changed from 2011 to 2016 to 2021? And so if spatial data is special because of the natural tendencies it has, so clustering, Tobler's law, autocorrelation, things like that, are similar processes occurring with temporal data. And just like spatial scales, there's time scales. So the time period in which a process occurs or is measured in. So things like seconds, hours, years, centuries, eons, etc. And so every major issue of study has some sort of time scale associated with it. Climate change operates on the scale of decades, economic meltdowns, the scale of months, disease, pandemic spread, weeks to months or years, natural disasters, so days, weeks, months, or even years, depending on the type of disaster it is. So what we're looking at and the time scale it operates on are very important things to think about. This brings up the idea of static versus dynamic features. So a static feature is something that's unchanging in time. Phenomena that doesn't change over time is said to be static. So static features only need to be collected once and they'll remain the same unless changed by an outside force. So in actuality, nothing in the universe is a static feature, but on the scale of human life or some of the scales that we're concerned with, there's plenty of examples of static features. For instance, the North Shore Mountains would be a static feature. They're not going to go anywhere unless an outside force does something to it. So mountains are a good example of that. On geologic timescales, they're not static features. They can be washed down by erosion, but on human timescales, they're not going to change. And then dynamic features are ones that are said to be constantly changing over time. They're active. So dynamic features must be captured often at a level that matches up with the temporal scale you're using. So again, census information, demographic information would be a dynamic feature. People are constantly moving. There's new births, new deaths, things like that. but there's plenty of examples of dynamic features in the natural world as well. So a coastline is a very dynamic feature. It changes with the tides, it changes with erosion, storm events can cause things, forest fires or species distribution. They're all dynamic or active. So how do we go about displaying temporal geospatial data? So 3 options I'm going to suggest for you are a series of static maps, each showing one point in time. You can do an animation through a series of static maps, or you can create dynamic maps that animate through time. These are more interactive that you can work with. So static maps are good for a small number of slices, but over a larger number doesn't work as well. So these are usually just a small number of maps, either collected at regular intervals, such as years, decades, or months, and they can show change over time. So some strengths are they work really well for printed form. Like the example I'm showing here is from a journal article looking at climate change in Canada. And so this is showing the seasons, January to March, April to June, July to September, October to December, and in relation to their snow cover and how it's projected to change over time. So we've got 4 slices here. It works really well with a small number. It's easy enough to compare. But this strategy doesn't work with a large number of time slices. So if you have a whole bunch of different slices you want to compare, it becomes very difficult to tease apart the details. And it might not clearly demonstrate subtle changes between slices over a long period of time. Another option is to just animate. So you can make a GIF, for instance. In simplest form, it's just showing one static map after another. So this is just an example of a river in South America and how it progresses over a couple decades. You can see very quickly and easily the change in the river with the formation of an oxbow lake and the meandering of the channel. So this is great. One of the strengths is it's good for web resources, and it can work well with short or medium time periods focused on one area. Some of the weaknesses, obviously, this doesn't work in print, and it does not work well for subtle changes over larger geographic areas. Another option, if you've got a lot of data over a large area, say, would be dynamic maps. So it's like an animation, but for an entire map, it allows you to zoom and pan, stop, click, navigate. Some of the strengths, again, this is ideal for web format, and it can incorporate many different data sources that can be used, can be turned on, turned off. Another weakness is, obviously, this doesn't work in print format. It can require internet connection, and they can be difficult to use for some circumstances. The one I've linked to here is pretty self-explanatory, though. So you can pause it, play it, zoom, pan, you can click and interact with and navigate the data. And so what this map is showing is every incident of police killing in the United States in 2020 alone. So it's pretty depressing and sobering graphic, but it does a pretty effective job at displaying the issue at hand. It's a very large, complex issue that happens over a large area across time. This does a good job of conveying the gravity of the situation. There's numerous types of change that can occur. So for instance, we can have no change. Again, that's something like a mountain, at least on a human time scale. You can have a location change. So that might be something like a delivery truck moving through its route throughout a day. You can have shape change. So maybe that might be like a school district gets rezoned after some census data is collected. You can have area change. So for instance, a forest fire can grow throughout time. You can have topology change. So topology just deals with the connectivity of things. So for instance, a transit line might get disconnected. So even though the rail line is still there, it's not connected to the rest of the transit system anymore. So an example would be the light rail line that was constructed during the Olympics. Runs along False Creek Flats. It's no longer active. The rails are still there, but it's not connected. Attribute change might be changing census demographics, for instance. You can have object deletion or removal. So that would be like deforestation. You can have object creation, say a new residential development gets put in. You can also have mergers. So for instance, if two properties get merged to consolidate and build a larger development on it, or inverse of that would be property division, for instance. You could split a property into two subunits. You could copy. So for instance, if you digitize a map, you could create a copy of a data record. There can be transmission of attributes. So for instance, COVID cases. You can have disappearance and reappearance of something. So for instance, that would be like migratory whales. So they're in a region at some point in time, and then they disappear. Science doesn't yet know where they go, but they come back next year.